that this lesson was brought out, as it is a topic that I think we kind of dance around in the church. We typically will segment and limit the area of study for this topic to youth weekends, to Bible camps, to youth days, and maybe young men leading services, those kinds of areas. But just as was mentioned Wednesday night by one of our teenagers, as he spoke up and delivered a devotional, just like any other man of the congregation would on a Wednesday evening before Bible class, and pointed out the realities of stress and dealing with stress. We'd be surprised that our teenagers struggle with very similar things, if not almost all the same things that we struggle with, just in a different context. And we can learn a lot from them. Of course, they can learn a lot from us, and we have no problem realizing that. I think the benefit is for us to realize we can learn a lot from them. And so, obviously, our teenagers don't typically come to this class, and so when we think about the auditorium class, the adult class, let's look at teenagers from the perspective of their common strengths, from their common weaknesses, and then ways in which we can specifically help them and aid them, and what we can do, what we can provide, and what they need from us. And so we have 9 points this morning, and we have 25 minutes to get through them, so that's unlikely. So I don't want to go too fast, but what I'm going to do, because I found out when doing an acrostic, sometimes good points want to be made, and so I'm going to make the points now, just by titling them out, and then we'll go through them, and if we don't get through them, it's for your benefit to maybe look at further. So letter T, first point, teenagers, generally common strengths. Number 1, toughness. We're going to look at the toughness of teenagers. Point number 2, letter E, enthusiasm. The enthusiasm of teenagers. Point number 3, letter E, encouragement. The encouragement of teenagers. Point number 4, letter N, network. The network that teenagers have access to. Again, the strengths of teenagers. Generally common weaknesses. Point number 5, apathy. Letter A, apathy. Point number 6, gallivanting. Gallivanting. Point number 7, letter E, ego. Point number 8, letter R, rebellion. And then point number 9, letter S, support. And that is what they need from us. So that final point is what they need from us. So let's begin here. Generally common strengths. So this is from a general perspective, common strengths that a teenager brings to the table as it relates to the Lord's church, as it relates to what we can gain from them, as it relates to what they're naturally kind of geared for, considering the context of what they face in life. So think about toughness. Teenagers are tough. And you might scratch your head if you have a teenager and be wondering how that's possible that we're applying this. But I want you to think about some things for a moment, and we're going to start with contemplating, for example, a toddler. Think about the things that a toddler goes through. You look at a toddler, look at someone who is young in years, just getting out of that infancy stage, not yet nearly at that big kid stage. What is it that toddlers have to overcome? Well, they're crawling. I mean, they're not even walking necessarily yet, or they're learning how to walk. They're teething. They're trying to overcome the teeth coming through and the pain that comes with it. They can't even talk well yet. They can barely even identify certain things. They require constant tons of authority figures over them. They have to deal with parents. They have to deal with teachers. They have to deal with administrators, bosses, coaches, and adults, period. They're lowest on the totem pole as it relates to those that are somewhat autonomous in this life. And so they're, kind of last in line, if you will. And so sometimes it might feel like they aren't able to accomplish much, but every day they face is taken on with toughness. And so all of these challenges make young people well positioned to be tough as they learn to rely on God. What is it that Jeremiah thought as God came to Jeremiah? Look with me in Jeremiah chapter 1. God here comes to Jeremiah. Jeremiah is kind of scratching his head, as maybe some teenagers would do, or even parents of teenagers would do. God comes to Jeremiah. The word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah. And God says, Jeremiah says in response to God, identifying Jeremiah says in verse 6, "Behold, I cannot speak, for I am a child." Jeremiah says, I'm not worthy. I'm not to the point yet where I'm well qualified. I don't have years of experience. I don't have all these skills that I can bring to the table. I'm just a child. What does God say? Verse 7. "Say not, I am a child. For thou shalt go to all that I shall send thee, and whatsoever I command thee, thou shalt speak. Be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee to deliver thee, saith the Lord. Then the Lord put forth his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said unto me, Behold, I have put my words in thy mouth." So Jeremiah thought, I'm just a child. God says, say not that I am a child, and God is going to be with him. And so, again, toughness, common strengths typically of a teenager. What about enthusiasm? What's the difference between, say, a full-grown adult, and, we'll just classify that as someone who has gone through some rough waters in life, and has had to take on a great deal of responsibility, compared to a teenager? We could compare that in lots of different ways, but one of the ways that we're going to compare is looking at cynicism. Cynical. Adults sometimes can be very cynical. Why? Hey, they've been through difficult times. I've been down that road before. I know what that leads to. Oh, I don't know why you try this. Why would you try that? If you're going to go do that, you're going to, end up with X, Y, and Z, and why would you waste your time doing this? We tend to kind of become cynical in our older years because we've experienced some things. Well, teenagers aren't bogged down with that kind of cynicism. They don't have that to overcome. Why? In many respects, because they're wet behind the ears, they're green, they're new, they're fresh. They don't know the difficulties yet that they're going to face. And if you think about just the very definition of enthusiasm, it's intense and eager enjoyment and interest. The actual etymology of the word has to do with religious fervor resulting in divine influence. And so basically someone who was labeled as enthusiastic, as the term was initially defined, was someone who was viewed as being divinely influenced. Hey, look at that individual. Based upon their eagerness, clearly they are being influenced by the divine in some kind of way. In other words, there's something about them that allows them to be so positive and see things in such an optimistic light and with such boldness. They're enthusiastic. And so now we have the common definition today, again, intense and eager enjoyment and interest. You take, for example, from my perspective as a preacher, adults hear a sermon. That could result in a couple of things. One, it's nap time. Two, well, my grandfather preached that sermon. I've heard this several times. Or so-and-so needs to hear that lesson. Or maybe, why don't we hear sermons like that anymore? Okay? Common, typical results, feedback from adults. Teenagers hear a sermon. They're activated. They're excited. They can't wait to engage with the text, be emotionally in tune, seek application. Some of the greatest memories I have as a preacher is coming down from the pulpit, maybe guest speaking somewhere, and being rushed by the teenagers with a whole bunch of questions about the sermon.
just because they're engaged, they're in tune, they're excited, and they're describing how they recognize ways in which they can apply it and different things they learned and different questions maybe even they have from a doctrinal perspective. That's exciting, filled with enthusiasm. Well, sometimes I think as adults we want to squash that, and we don't recognize that that's a strength. Take, for example, what happened with David. What happened with David as Goliath there is threatening God's people in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Look with me there, beginning in verse 28. 1 Samuel 17, verse 28. Eliab, the older brother of David, he hears what David is saying. He wants to know what's going on here with this Philistine, and he's angry. Eliab is angry. He's angry against David. He says, "Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness?" What is he doing? He's putting them down. He's criticizing him. Why are you down here? Who's kept those few little sheep that you're supposed to be tending to? You don't belong here, David. You shouldn't be here, David. He goes on. "I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle." Here is a group of adults, a group of responsible parties who should have rose to the occasion and met Goliath where he was at and settled the score. But what are they doing? Oh, they're evaluating the situation. They're assessing the context. They're considering the proper strategy. They're trying to decide what they should do. David shows up. He says, "What's going on here? This Philistine is threatening God's people. What's going on? What's happening here?" Notice verse 33. Verse 33 of 1 Samuel 17. Verse 32, actually, beginning, David says to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul says to David, "Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." David, what are you doing? You're just a young buck. What are you doing? All enthusiastic up in here trying to take down this Philistine? This isn't your role. This isn't your place. David's sure of it, though. Of course, in verse 37, he says, "The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." Saul says to David, "Go, and the Lord be with thee." And then, of course, David's speech there to the Philistine, verse 45, "Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied." Enthusiasm. Teenagers have it, just naturally. Haven't experienced yet the rough waters of life. What are some other general common strengths of a teenager? Toughness, enthusiasm, encouragement. Encouragement. Again, they have a lot to combat. Challenges of social life, challenges of peer pressure, challenges of temptation. You notice something there? Haven't we studied that the past couple weeks? Social life, peer pressure, temptation. Now we're studying teenagers. I think those that wrote this book had some thoughts in mind leading into the school year. Teenagers need our help. But teenagers also provide a whole lot of encouragement. You know, we aren't challenged the same way. Most of us think TikTok has something to do with a bug of some kind that sticks to our skin. We don't know what it is. But not our teenagers. They engage with it every day. They're involved with all kinds of aspects of life that most of us are completely detached from or are only forced to be attached to because of our jobs or whatever. We don't really have an interest in it. But teenagers are being raised up in that environment that we are clueless to. But yet, the difficulties and the hardships they face haven't changed. It's just the way that it's delivered unto them. And yet, every time they're here, they're an encouragement to us. Did you notice what John writes in 1 John chapter 2? 1 John chapter 2. Notice there in verse 13, John says that he is writing, the middle there of the verse, to the young men. Why? They have overcome the wicked one. Notice also verse 14. Again, middle part of the verse. He's writing to the young men. Why? Because they are strong and the word of God abides in them, and they have overcome the wicked one. Every day, as we sometimes even pray and are mindful of, our teenagers are being bombarded with the temptations of sin in ways and in relation to youthful lust that many of us are completely detached from. Yet they overcome it. They fight it. We can be encouraged by that. They also have an area of strength that many of us are kind of removed from as it relates to their network. Almost all young people know people. They may not necessarily be best friends with a bunch of folks. They may not have a group of friends that are noteworthy in terms of, hey, this is a lot of folks that they're connected to. But just by the mere fact of them being involved with the lives of young people to some degree or another, socially, academically, as they continue to grow from an employment perspective, they are able to relate to young people in ways that we cannot. And that matters. Does it matter to us that Jesus is able to relate to us? Yes, it does. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, he was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin. In other words, Jesus knows what we go through, and that brings us comfort because we now can find strength in him in that he's not clueless to our difficulties. Jesus knows all about our struggles. We'll sing sometimes. Well, guess what? Do you know all about the struggles of a teenager? Do you know all the struggles about a young person? Yes, in concept you do. But you don't know from a specific perspective. You're removed from that. Even if you tried to remember, you probably have grown up so much now that you would give yourself a lecture if you even got there. But not teenagers. They can relate to that. They know what that's like. And that network is an opportunity. Think about what Paul tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he starts there in verse 19. He says, "For though I be free from all men, yet I have made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more. And unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. To them that are without law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some." Paul sought to relate. Now, we can do our best to try to relate. But generally, if we're going to throw out phrases like awesome sauce to the young people, they're going to immediately roll their eyes and scratch their head and just call us lame. We're not going to do very well in trying to relate to teenagers. But we can relate to our young people here in this congregation. And we can be genuine and authentic, and we can try to understand where they're coming from. And by doing so, by extension, they are being taught and trained by our very example and efforts to do that to them, to then do that to those around them. Not embracing the sin, not ever being without law to Christ, just as Paul is explaining here, but showing their peers what it means to be a Christian by caring for them, identifying with them, and relating to them in ways that simply we cannot. Strengths, common strengths that a teenager brings to the table. But what are some common weaknesses? I wanted to start where we did because this is not an area that we have as much difficulty with. It's pretty easy for us to recognize the weaknesses. So we started with the strengths, but let's also just be aware of some of the weaknesses that they have to be sensitive to, that we also can be mindful of to try to aid them. I'd say weakness number one, and probably the most dangerous of them all. I know that these kinds of sermons have been taught and preached, and I know our elders are aware of this. I know that many older brethren are aware of this, and that's apathy. Young people are constantly tempted to be apathetic, to not care, to not try, to not apply themselves, to not aspire toward excellence. They're being continuously pressured to stop trying. Notice in John chapter 12 that the religious leaders had this temptation before them. They could have become enthusiastic. They could have become devoted and committed and convicted in the gospel and lived for Jesus. But instead, they allowed peer pressure to tempt them and chose their social life of being friends with the world rather than being friends with Christ. Verse 42 of John 12, nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they love the praise of men more than the praise of God. Common weakness that teenagers have to face is apathy. Common weakness that teenagers have to face, gallivanting. The pursuing of pleasure from place to place. Just going around and seeking to fulfill desires. Hedonism isn't new, okay? It was very common in the first century. It was a Greek lifestyle, hedonism. In today's society, I think we're given the idea that somehow we're being freed from the restraints of religion. We're being freed from Christ. We're being freed from the gospel and the Bible and no longer having these rules that bind us, and we're engaging in whatever pleasure we see fit. Folks, that's hedonism. It's not new. It's gallivanting. It's going around from place to place, and wherever you are, what is it that's going to satisfy my pleasures and fulfill my desires in the moment? That's not new. Well, obviously, teenagers are tempted with this continually, and the sales pitch, the temptation is, that's where joy is found. Hey, just have some beers. Just drink a beer with me. Hey, just, do some drugs. Let's just engage in some fornication. Let's just go do this and that and not really care at all what it is that we should be doing and just be fulfilling the lusts that we're interested in the moment. Because there you will find joy. Well, joy is not found in those activities. Happiness is not found in those activities. Where is joy found? In the Lord is where joy is found. Philippians 4 and verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say, rejoice. And so the temptation is that, hey, in these other aspects of life, as I gallivant around and I go from friend to friend and context to context, I'm told that if I engage in this activity or in that activity, that I'm going to have joy, that I'm going to be blissful, happy. When was the last time you saw an alcohol commercial and the person drinking the beer looked miserable and was dreading all the serious consequences that would come in drinking that beer? When was the last time you saw that commercial? I don't know about you, but I've never seen that commercial. Never seen that commercial. Every time it's pitched, how's it pitched? Oh, it's the greatest life ever. That's not where joy is found. Joy is found in the Lord. Go ahead, Tom. That's right. That's right. That's right. And the joy is not found in that moment and in those physical pleasures. It is found ultimately in the Lord. Weakness number 3, ego. Ego. So that's the challenge, right? Teenagers that we talked about, hey, toughness, enthusiasm, encouragement, network. But guess what? With that also comes the temptation to what? Pound your chest a little bit. I'm somebody, right? That ego temptation, cleaving onto self and self-promotion. You got to remember and recall, not just for teenagers, this is for all of us, what Paul tells the Romans in chapter 12 and in verse 3, that every man that is among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Folks, it's not about us. It's not about us. And teenagers have to be aware of this and sensitive to the reality that as a Christian, we're living our life not for ourselves, but for Christ. It's not about me. It's not contextualizing the world around me about me. And we have massive amounts of narcissism today, probably most likely because of social media. I mean, it's pretty hard not to become narcissistic when you go around all day doing this and sending every update with every line and every thought you have, not to then think that life literally revolves around you. I mean, it's very difficult to all of a sudden just one day say, oh, life doesn't revolve around me. But Paul said in Galatians 2 and verse 20, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ which liveth in me. I'm still living, he says. But the life that I'm now living is in Christ. Rebellion. Teenagers think, if I can just get myself freed from this authority. Remember we talked about toughness. So teenagers get this idea that, oh, the dread of authority. If I can just be unbound and released and have no constraints on me. Well, guess what? Doesn't matter who you are, how much money you have, how powerful you are. Guess what? There's restraints on you of some kind, no matter what. You can never free yourself from any type of restraint. It's not possible. So let's just start there, because then you'll realize that what you're pursuing is not achievable. But then realize the reality that freeing yourself from any situation where you have to be submissive is not going to in some way bring liberty. Think about that for a second. Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Who lived in the truth? Jesus. Who did he submit to? Pilate. Where did he end up? The cross. This idea that I can only be free if I don't have to submit is false. Jesus showed us that. And sometimes we as adults can make that clear to our teenagers as well and say, hey, I have to submit. I don't agree the fact that I can only go 25 miles an hour on this road, but guess what? It says 25 miles an hour, cruise control set. I don't like it, but I have to submit, Romans 13. I have to submit, the husband's going to say, possibly. Hey, I have a boss that I don't like that I have to wrestle with every day, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what I think, I have to do what my boss says. The wife will say, I have to submit. I don't agree with 90% of what my husband thinks, but you know what? We're married. And I have to be joyful in it. We all have to submit. And so maybe relating a little bit to our teenagers and giving them the reality that, guess what? The fact that you have to submit as a teenager, it's not just unique to you. Because when you become an adult, you still have to submit if you want to be right with God. And even if you fight it every single day, the end of your life ultimately we'll all have to submit. Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. Finally, what do they need from us? They need support. They need support. When was the last time you esteemed a teenager? And I'm not talking about going up to them and saying, great job. I'm talking about in your mind, you put a teenager up on a pedestal. You looked at the life of a teenager and you thought, wow, they are special. You might say, well, why would we do that? Jesus did it to us. Philippians 2 and verse 3, Paul says, We need to esteem others better than ourselves. In the context there, Philippians 2, he then goes on to describe the fact that Christ esteemed us better than himself. Let me ask you a question. Is he more valuable than us? He's divine. We didn't deserve his servitude. We didn't deserve his consideration. We didn't deserve his sacrifice. He's better than us, yet he died in our stead. He esteemed us better than himself. Our teenagers need support. Our teenagers need us to view them in a way that is valuable, that is considerate. Go ahead, brother. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yes. 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 Amen. Amen. And I think the takeaway that you're really highlighting is tensionality. We can't just flippantly go around and, accidentally help our teenagers. There's a need, as it's being commanded there in Titus 2. They need our help. They need our help. And so what a blessing it is that we try to be pointed and strategic and specific in targeting and trying to aid and serve our young people.